It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe, Friday, May 17th, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Reno, Nevada, I am John Ramey. Vladimir Putin visits Beijing. A Russian offensive is reportedly stalled by Ukraine defensive forces around Kharkiv. Tariffs and electric vehicles and the Chinese auto industry. And Blinken's tone-deaf rock and roll cameo. That's what's going on this Friday. Hi, Sam.
Hi, John.
Let's start with Vladimir Putin in Beijing. This is an update on the diplomatic front of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There is also a military update, but this is an interesting, I think, diplomatic update. Reuters reporting a couple of days ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in an interview published on Wednesday, said he backed China's plan for a peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis invasion, saying Beijing had a full understanding of what was, the root cause of the invasion. Putin spoke to a Chinese news agency, and he said that Russia remained open to dialogue and talks to solve the more than 2-year-old conflict. So China had put out a proposal for peace that was pretty vague about a year ago, and Russian authorities, Putin and others, had kind of said, it's not bad. But now all of a sudden, Putin is saying this is something that's actionable. Is this just a case of Putin maybe trying to find an off-ramp that does not involve the West? Because that would be his worst fears. Somehow his war ends without total conquest and the West gets to congratulate themselves on being a peacemaker?
I think it's just obfuscation. I don't think he has any real intention of pursuing any sort of peace plan. Perhaps, though, he wants to just sort of keep his options open, right? I mean, for example, there's the new offensive that Russia is launching right now, which I'm sure we'll discuss. Part of the reason for that, people seem to think, is because the United States actually finally approved an arms shipment.
Right.
And those arms are on their way. And so if you're going to do this, you pretty much ought to do it now. And so if he thinks that those arms might help forestall the advances that Russia has been making while Ukraine has been waiting for the arms, then, at some point pursuing some sort of peace settlement might be worth his time. But I think it's just sort of dancing around. I don't honestly think there's any real substance to him saying that he endorses this plan. I don't think China is really all that concerned in reality about, what happens in Ukraine. Also, in some ways, it's sort of a indirect riposte to the criticism that China has got a few weeks ago from the United States, right? Where the United States, Antony Blinken prevailed upon the Chinese to use their influence with Russia to try and bring an end to the war in Ukraine. And so China is sort of saying, yeah, okay, well, fine. We'll do this again, right? Instead of having to do anything in reality. Interestingly, though, it's been reported that it seems as though Chinese exports to Russia have declined slightly in recent months, or that is in recent weeks. And whether that's an actual substantive response to Western criticism of Chinese backing for Russia's war, it's difficult to say. I mean, you'd think that China would want to have all the economic activity that it could have these days.
Right. And Russia at war is a very good customer for China.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like the greatest.
Yes, but
go ahead.
At the same time, China denies that they're helping with Russia's military effort, right?
Would they just say it's just economic relationships?
I mean, for instance, the criticism that they've been getting from the West is that they're providing dual use components.
Oh, right, of course,
right. Yes. And they're saying no, we're not. But the point is that they've explicitly refrained from sending single use, that is, military only use components, right? Unlike North Korea, right, which is sending Russia
bullets.
artillery shells and things like this. I mean, So China is at least making a show of not supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine, in part because they want to be able to point a finger at the United States, right? It's just like, well, we're not arming this conflict, you are, and you're
Right.
not even pretending not to.
Right. And then you tell us to use our influence. Sure, I get it. It's a pretty cunning positioning. Xi's additional principles in this proposal called for a, quote, cooling down of the situation, conditions for restoring peace and creating stability and minimizing the impacts on the world economy. So basically, like, it's pretty generic, and
Yeah, absolutely.
it's anodyne.
Entirely, yeah.
So we shouldn't be dreaming of some magic bullet Chinese solution to the end of this war.
Oh, certainly not.
Okay.
No. I mean, I suppose at some point it could come to pass. But if you look at what's actually happening, it seems as though things are actually ramping up from both sides. Right? Russia has opened a new front in the northeast of Ukraine near Kharkiv. And as you mentioned, Ukraine says that they've at least been able to stall that offensive. They've also been launching their own attacks onto Crimea and across the border from Kharkiv in Russia itself, in Belgorod. And in fact, this was sort of quiet last week, but the United States lifted its prohibition on using American-supplied weaponry inside of Russia itself, which had been in place throughout the entirety of the war so far. In this, they were actually following Great Britain. Lord David Cameron, a couple weeks ago, gave the UK's blessing to Ukraine to use British-supplied weapons inside of Russian territory itself.
Yeah, from Kiev, AP reporting Ukrainian units locked in street battles with Russian forces in the key northeastern Ukraine town, which is Vovchansk, that is near Kharkiv, near the Russian border. Reportedly have halted the Russian advance, according to military officials in Kiev. They claimed that yesterday. A senior Moscow official says the frontline push has enough resources to keep going. So obviously, nobody's going to say that their side of the war is going poorly. But the Ukrainian claim that the offensive around Kharkiv has been stopped has not been independently verified, according to the AP. Russian attempts to establish a foothold in the town of Vovchansk, among the largest towns in the northeastern Kharkiv region, had a pre-war population of 17,000. 8,000, I believe, have been evacuated. So it's a situation where Russia it's almost, sorry to do this, Sam, it's almost a bit like the Great War when Germany's trying to go ahead and win it before all the U.S. support arrives on the
continent. In a way, yes.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's true. Although this particular theater,
I mean, obviously, not U.S. troops aren't going to Ukraine, but
the
U.S. aid is.
Yes,
and there's a lag.
This particular theater in the Northeast, I've seen a number of military analysts in this week that seem to believe that the number of troops that they have in on the other side of the border, in the Belgorod region, that is the Russians, seem to have about 35 to 40,000 troops. And military analysts don't seem to think that 35 to 40,000 is a sufficient number of troops to actually take Kharkiv, which would be calamitous for Ukraine if that were to actually happen. One such analyst is Marina Maron from King's College London, whom I've seen on television dozens of times since the war broke out, and I'm sure many of our regular listeners have also. And that's one of the things she said, was that 35 to 40,000 troops probably isn't enough. The tactic would seem to be to try and get Ukraine to redirect forces from further south. And obviously they've had to do some of that to some extent. But it's difficult to say. I'm glad you brought up, though, because I think this is something that applies also in the war in Gaza, for example, is that in any war, both sides are going to lie to the media.
Of course.
That's part of fighting the war, actually, right? And so in Gaza, for example, there's been this ongoing debate the entire time, right, about whether the casualty figures provided by Hamas are accurate or not. By the way, in the previous two incursions by Israel into Gaza since they ended their occupation of Gaza back in the middle of the aughts, the IDF later came out with casualty figures that were lower than the figures provided by Hamas, but not by very much. So this idea that you can't trust Hamas's casualty figures has no empirical basis whatsoever. In fact, there is some empirical basis to say that they're generally pretty accurate. Maybe they're not this time. They could be lying this time. But again, both sides are going to lie. The IDF has been caught lying themselves dozens and dozens and dozens of times over the years in this conflict and in others. So this idea that we need to trust this side's numbers as opposed to that side's numbers, it's fanciful. I'm sorry for the little tangent there.
I will just punctuate that with another great war anecdote, right? The Spanish flu pandemic. Why was it the Spanish flu? Because Spain was neutral. They were the only ones who could report a terrible flu decimating their population.
Right.
The Allies had it, the Central Powers had it, but they couldn't admit it.
That's right. Yeah.
It's crazy.
And plus, people are dying all the time. I mean,
so that is what's going on the ground in Russia. And again, the lag in U.S. Aid really creating an opportunity for the Russians to potentially take Kharkiv, although apparently, or reportedly, the Ukrainians have stopped them, which is good news.
For now, yeah, but we'll see. I mean, if something like the fall of Kharkiv were to happen, now, John, you and I, in our sort of partisan American political standpoint, we'd say, oh, this is all on Trump and Mike Johnson and stuff like this. But let's be real about this. If Kharkiv falls, or God forbid, if Ukraine should lose this war and the failure to provide arms in a timely fashion by the United States has some role in that,
that's on all of us.
America.
That's right.
It's
the fact that it's even politically viable for this delay to have happened is squarely on the voters.
Absolutely right, and it will just give the Russians and the Chinese more rhetorical ammunition to say, you can't trust the United States, right? They don't really mean it. They say they stand for this and that, but when the chips are down, they won't come through.
Shall we pivot to tariffs and the Chinese auto industry? I did some reading on Wikipedia, just generally about the Chinese auto industry, Sam. And like probably every other sector of the Chinese economy, it's pretty fascinating when you kind of peel away just the basics, right?
Yes.
Should we start with the tariff announcement?
I think so.
That's kind of our end point.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. When we previewed this segment at the end of last week's episode, we thought that we might have to depart to some extent from the vagaries of the regular news cycle. But we didn't have to, because later that same day, the Wall Street Journal, followed by other outlets, reported that the Biden administration was going to raise tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles by 100%. And as opposed to, that is in addition to other tariff increases of not as large, but also substantial increases on other products such as steel and things like that. And so literally, by the time we'd finished taping this episode, we were given a good jumping off point to discuss this.
So that was leaked. And then on Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden announced a series of new and increased tariffs. This is reporting from the New York Times on certain Chinese made goods. You mentioned 100% on electric vehicles, 25% duty on steel and aluminum, or aluminium for our British listeners, 50% levies on semiconductors and solar panels. And the Times mentions the tariff on electric vehicles made in China quadrupled from 25%. 25 times 4 is 100. Chinese lithium ion batteries for electric cars will now face a 25% tariff. That's up from 7.5%. Okay. There is no flood of cheap Chinese electric vehicles in the United States.
That's right. In the case of electric vehicles, these are preemptive tariffs, right?
Super preemptive.
Absolutely, right? It's not going to raise the price of actual Chinese vehicles in this state because there aren't any. But it does give American and other nationalities of auto manufacturers breathing room on prices. They can charge more because they won't have low price competitors that are coming from China.
They won't be undercut.
Yeah. So it's not like anybody's prices for electric vehicles are actually going to go up. It's just that they won't go down. There was a chance that they might go down. Not anytime real soon, but coming up at some point, they might have done so.
Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, essentially said this is not going to impact the purchasing experience of the U.S. consumer.
And I think that's probably right. That is not to the point, not so much that they would notice, right? There's not, again, you can't have a price increase on cars you're not able to buy.
Right.
I mean, it's not, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing in a way. But
the Chinese response was pretty good. They said the United States must be losing their minds.
Yes. That
was pretty aggressive.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Janet Yellen, though, because, of course, she was in China not all that long ago.
Using chopsticks, charming them.
That's right. And I think it's important to realize that when these meetings happen, especially in China, right, we see there's always a group photo of everybody sitting around the table looking very earnest and determined, right? But apart from that, we don't actually know what happens in the room, right? We get to read the English language Chinese media afterwards that says what the Chinese said. And then Janet Yellen holds a press conference where she tells the world press what the Americans said. But the actual words used are never divulged. And I think it's important that we understand that. I'm guessing that at that meeting, Yellen, using, of course, the most diplomatic language she could have mustered, probably at least gave the Chinese a hint that this was coming, right? Saying, look, I'm sorry, we're just, you're not going to do this. And I'm sure that, the Chinese have every right to be angry about this. I was watching a report on CNBC about the Chinese auto industry, and they said that over the course of, I believe it was about the past 15 years, it was from 2009 onwards, the Chinese central government, or the Chinese government anyway, they said, had supported their own domestic auto industry to the point of about $27 billion. Now, over 14, 15 years, that's not really a lot of money. They didn't really clarify, though, whether that was just the central government or whether that included provincial level subsidies, of which there are many. But still, I couldn't help but think that $27 billion is quite a lot less than the $80 billion that the United States gave out to what was then Fiat Chrysler and General Motors in the auto industry.
The bailout of 08.
Yeah. 09, actually. Right?
Sure, sorry.
And so, again, we don't know what goes on inside the room. So I would like to adopt a sort of phraseology of what the Chinese might say. It's just like, oh, you're mad at us because we subsidize our auto industry? Horrors, right? I mean, how could anyone do such a thing? Right? Seriously, you're going to point your finger at us about this? And at least, by the way, when we do it, we're getting something out of it, right? As you might recall, when the auto industry bailout happened, this was right at the beginning of the Obama administration. Right. And there was some idea anyway that in return for the bailout, the auto industry could come across with some help for Obama in his own environmental legislation agenda. The problem was that Obama spent so much of his political capital trying to get his healthcare plan through that his environmental agenda was basically dead in the water. So the auto companies essentially got off for free, right? They got the money for nothing.
And they kept selling giant trucks and SUVs.
That's right. They didn't do anything. And then when Trump became elected, he made it very clear that they didn't have to do anything. But it's not like they didn't see the reports about climate change. It's not like they didn't know this was going to happen. So again, the Chinese might say, look, okay, yeah, we subsidize our industry. So do you. What are you getting out of it? Right.
Whereas China has some of the worst air pollution in the world. And that's why there's over 9 million new energy vehicles sold in China since 2011. That's
right.
3 times what we have here.
Exactly. And so and I couldn't help but notice also that when
Sam,
Biden,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's an important point. China has an environmental crisis. They at least implemented a solution to reduce fossil fuel burning combustion engines and to help clean up their super toxic air pollution.
Absolutely. But I couldn't help but notice that when announcing these tariffs on Tuesday, President Biden talked about strategic industries. Now, I can't recall any other American president talking about the auto industry as a strategic industry. But I was glad to hear President Biden say so, because that's what I really thought was going on here. Not so much on our end as on the Chinese end. Because yes, you're right. They want to help clear their air and have a better environment for their citizens to live in.
They have a more acute air pollution problem. Significantly.
Yes. And by the way, this has been a large source of public discontent for them.
For decades.
Yes, but there's a geopolitical strategy involved here also, I think, because, again, these are the products that China is investing the most in: electric vehicles, solar panels, batteries. Now, by the way, these all work very well together. And I
have some solar panels and batteries myself. I'm pretty sure they're made in China.
Okay. But this, I think, helps China gain influence in the broader world, especially in the global south. But we've talked a lot about the unrest in the Sahel recently. You know what the Sahel has lots of? Sunshine, right? And so if you're a farmer in the Sahel,
you don't want to wait for a public work to build a grid. You're like, give me a solar panel and a battery.
And an electric tractor or some other form of farm vehicle, right? And I don't know if China is making this pitch to African countries now.
No, but it's pretty obvious.
Ought to be.
If we're making it, they should be.
All right. I'm confident that it's probably happening. I just haven't heard about it. But that, I think, and by the way, climate change is a global issue, and countries in the Sahel are suffering from it worse than we are. We're having catastrophic weather here right now, by the way, right? But China can say, look, the United States thinks they're the leading country of the world. They're not. This is the global challenge facing all of humanity. We are the country addressing it, and they're pretending. Now, I'm not saying that I completely agree with that thesis.
Right, but it's an understandable narrative.
It's compelling, okay? And in general, that is, in a perfect world, I might side with people more on the neoliberal side of things. You said, look, if Biden is serious about wanting Americans to drive electric cars, he should just allow every country to ship electric cars to America. There are tariffs on European electric cars, by the way, also, or trade restrictions of some sort, at least, because that will drive down the price of electric vehicles for Americans, and more people will buy them. And I get that. And in theory, I agree with that. But the problem is, if only one country dominates the electric vehicle landscape, that's just bad for everybody, right? Competition needs to exist not just inside of a given market, but across the global market. For instance, the European Union hasn't announced trade restrictions on electric vehicles thus far. They're still investigating, right? But I can pretty much guarantee you they're gonna, right? The United States won't be the only one. However, I should say that even though Wang Yi said that, the Americans have lost their minds, right?
He's the foreign minister of China.
Yeah, that's the foreign minister of China. He didn't say anything about what they were going to do to retaliate. And I'm not saying they won't, but I don't think they actually care because, again, or they don't care very much, I should say. This is a global geostrategy play as much as it's an economic domestic play for China. And they're going from strength to strength in this. And I think it's the strategic angle here that's underreported, if at all. Probably there's somebody with at a foreign policy think tank who's published a paper about this, and I just hasn't managed to cross my path thus far. But I think that's the most important part, actually. And I can understand. For instance, CNBC has been all over this story, but they talk about they're a business and financial channel. Those are the angles that they explore. Here and there, they touch on the science of the batteries, but only to explain why the products are so compelling from a business standpoint. Other kinds of news outlets explore this from a sort of economic or United States trade perspective, right? But if you put all these things together, right, like this whole scenario I just mapped out of the Chinese pitch to Africa about this,
right.
I just made that up on my own. I don't even know if it's actually happening.
Right, but it's obvious. China is very obviously positioning itself to have the solution or a huge solution to the greatest problem facing all of us.
Yes,
it would be like if the United States had invented some sort of Apple product that helped, solve climate change instead of just some dumb phone.
Yeah, and so in as much as we seem to understand that China is our great global competitor, I just feel like we could use some better reporting on exactly what the dimensions of that competition are. And
yes, there's a zero-sum game in one sense where, as ostensibly the defenders of freedom and liberal democracy, we don't want authoritarian communist China being the light of hope in the 21st century, or seen to be the light of hope in the 21st century. But by the same token, if it's a Chinese-led policy and a Chinese technology that reduces the output of greenhouse gases and reduces the use of the combustion engine globally, that's good for Americans. That's good for everybody.
And not just that, but to return to the first topic we discussed, when Xi and Putin were meeting this week, they explicitly spoke out against an American-led hegemonic order.
Well, that's why I don't want China to succeed in this, even though it's good for the environment.
Well, I mean, the thing is, though, John, it doesn't matter what you want. All right.
I know, but I'm just saying it's hard to root for China, even if they are saving the world.
I get that. Right. But the thing is, China, for instance, BYD, the largest electric vehicle manufacturer in China, they're opening factory in Mexico. OK, and the idea is that if they can source enough of the parts for the cars they build in Mexico, they can get around American trade restrictions through NAFTA, or the successor to NAFTA. And they are planning factories in Brazil, right? For example, right? They could sell cars all over Latin America from there, right? So it doesn't matter, right? I mean, whether we're going to buy them or not, they don't care, right? They're going to sell them to everybody else. And it supports their narrative that the United States, again, as in the case of not supplying arms to Ukraine, the United States is a decrepit, unreliable partner. They say they want to lead, but they're not able to do it. We're actually doing it. And this is again, I can understand why Biden wants to think of this as a strategic challenge, because it really is one. And so if he can give the American auto industry a few more years of breathing room to try and catch up, right, to finally get their heads out of their asses and do something, right? Because they've been dragging their feet on this for more than a decade, and it'll be to the detriment of the country if they continue to do so.
China's new electric vehicle or new energy vehicle policy has been in place since 2009. I mean, they've been doing this most of the century.
Yes, and I think it's interesting also that Donald Trump has said for many years that climate change is a hoax that is designed to benefit the Chinese.
Actually, it's real, and it's going to benefit the Chinese.
That's right. He's half right. Yeah. And I think in his own clumsy way, for example, one of the biggest early American investors in Chinese electric vehicles was Warren Buffett. Going back to 2008, I think Donald Trump pays a bit more attention to Warren Buffett than you and I do, right? I think he knew that Buffett was doing this, and he could see how this could impact things. So as much as we all like to make fun of Donald Trump and think that he can't possibly be right about anything, I think he might have been onto something here. But of course, Biden's 100% tariff on electric vehicles is actually the same amount of tariff that Trump says he wants to charge against all Chinese products, right?
Well, that's insane. I mean, your iPhone would cost $18,000.
No, it's ridiculous.
I mean, that's not the real calculation, but our economy as we know it would be unsustainable with such a policy.
To be fair, he's also said that...
I mean, he says crazy things, so...
He also said that he's using this as a bargaining ploy, right? That you have to start somewhere in your negotiation in order to get anything substantial, right? Now,
Point taken, Mr. Trump.
Yeah. But, I mean,
Sam, I understand that the United States is trying to have vision and policy and leadership on this issue. But let me just make a free market argument about this. Let's say China floods Latin America and Mexico with sourceable parts in North America and Central America or whatever, and electric vehicles explode. Let's just say in Mexico. The primordial kind of Main Street capitalism that exists in Southern California, in places like Santa Ana or the Inland Empire, like there are dudes who have cousins in Mexico who work on cars. That's their whole job. There are a lot of these people. If all of a sudden there are cheap, reliable electric vehicles and parts that they can get from their cousin, maybe, right, in Mexico, the free market will actually create a market for this within the United States, even with tariffs. And I wonder, does the United States have to have, well, I mean, I would like them to have a vision and a policy, but like if the Chinese have a runaway hit with electric vehicles in this hemisphere, wouldn't kind of free market principles eventually just get it here anyway?
Eventually, yes.
Is that scenario make sense? I think it might be a little nuanced for those of us who haven't.
It does, but the problem with economics is that
people are resourceful.
But the thing is, actual economies don't work exactly the same way that the economics textbooks tell us that they ought to. Right there, that's close.
I'm not thinking of an economics textbook. I'm thinking of friends you and I have who work on their hot rods in Orange County.
But cars are different. The auto industry is a capital intensive industry. To build an auto plant, it costs lots and lots and lots of money, right? It's easier with electric cars. I'll grant you that. There's not as many parts, but still. And then you have to have the dealerships and stuff like this. It's a big upfront investment. And
to say nothing of charging stations.
It's not like phones, right? It's just a whole other order of magnitude on an industrial.
I guess maybe I was thinking more like Fender guitars made in Mexico or something.
Yeah, but again, it's a huge
massive
step up from there, right? And so I don't think that's quite so applicable here. I would say though, like I've thought for a while that it's going to be quite some time before I see Chinese-made electric cars on the streets of the United States. All right. Now I think it's going to take even longer since these tariffs were announced. And that's just disappointing to me because I was really looking forward to seeing the commercials on television of, people of all walks of life driving around in their BYD electric cars, having a great time and stuff like this, while the background music is a repurposed version of the Michael Jackson classic TYT.
Oh,
right. Which I think, would be just a fantastic commercial. But I'm not sure.
That's a high licensing fee, but they probably have the money.
Yeah, right. It would be worth it. It would be sort of like when Bill Gates insisted on using "Start Me Up" by the Rolling Stones
for Windows 95.
Windows 95, and pestered Mick Jagger about
only
it
because REM
months.
refused. Only because REM refused to license "It's the End of the World as We Know It." Right?
Oh, is that right? I didn't know.
I may have made that up.
Okay.
But yes. Okay. Speaking of music, it's our entry point to my little editorial. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, made a surprise visit to Kyiv, Ukraine. He took the stage alongside a local band called 1999, and he played Neil Young's Keep on Rockin' in the Free World. The Secretary of State, a 62-year-old wealthy white man in a tucked-in shirt, played a cherry red Epiphone.
That he seemingly brought with him, by the way.
Listen, the reason I'm bringing this up, Sam, is because we are generally very supportive of the seriousness and the clear-eyed nature of the Biden administration in foreign policy, especially when contrasted how deeply unserious so many American political leaders are regarding this most fraught geopolitical, global, international situation. Blinken, with an apparently out-of-tune guitar, I haven't seen the footage, singing Neil Young, Keep on Rockin' in the Free World, is like the dumbest, most tone deaf. Like it makes it's worse than anything U2 would have done, like on the Rattle and Hum tour. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like
I know exactly what you're saying.
It's just so tone deaf. Also, it's another example of a politician not getting the meaning of a song, like Reagan campaigning on "Born in the USA."
Look, I agree with you 100%. Right?
Anyway, I have to excoriate this guy, and we are uniquely positioned as musicians.
But I hope that this is something that people forget about, because if it's remembered for a long time, it'll be because Ukraine loses, right? And it'll be another nail in the coffin we've been building all through this episode, where this is what America is, right? They let you down, and then they sit there and go, well, we're rocking in the free world, dude, right? And so I'm hoping that everybody's going to forget about this very soon.
All right. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. We will be back with you next Friday on Working for Crusoe. Have a great weekend.